Welcome to Unapologetically Sensitive, a place to find connection and a sense of belonging, where you can learn, relate, laugh, and maybe even live a bolder, brighter life. I'm your host, Patricia Young. This is a weekly podcast where we talk about sensitivity and the richness that it adds, the strengths we have because of our sensitivity, and some of the challenges it poses as well. The information in this podcast is not a substitute for help from a licensed mental health professional. Hey there, to the creatives, healers, sensitives, and deep thinkers. In this episode, we're talking about the concept of highly sensitive people being prone to addiction. And my guest today talks about her experience with addiction. I love it. She talks about the term kindsight instead of hindsight and talks about that feeling of being a chameleon before she went into recovery. And you don't have to be someone who's experienced any problems with alcohol. I think many of us as highly sensitive people often use things to help manage our feelings. So even if alcohol doesn't resonate with you, and we don't really spend a lot of time talking about alcohol addiction, but I think what we talk about in this episode is really about how we get that split from our authentic self when we're not seen and heard as kids and what happens. And she offers some really great tools about how to reconnect with yourselves. But Angela does talk about how she used alcohol to numb pain, insecurity, self-loathing. It's a depressant, and it felt like she was walking around without skin. And she talks about, it's not that she was a bad person, she was a sick person, and the way that she healed was to be loved back to life. Angela talks about the importance of knowing your triggers. Some of those things can be comparison. She offers a quiz at the end that you can take to figure out what type of inner critic you may have. She gives some very clear tools, what she calls bookends and park bench, and she explains what that is. She also talks about Russ Harris and ACT, which is acceptance commitment therapy, and why that's so helpful. And we talk about how it's really important to be willing to ask for help and there's no shame in it. And we talk about it's okay if you're resistant to asking for help or you're resistant to wanting to get any kind of help in whatever you're struggling with, that's part of the process and there's no judgment with that. And she also talks about if you're an entrepreneur or a creative, you don't have to do things by the book. And this is where we have an amazing conversation about the ways that we think that we're not showing up correctly or doing things right really often ends up being a gift and a strength. And I share something that I felt like I was doing wrong in my practice. It really ends up being my superpower when I work with people. So let me tell you a little bit about Angela. Angela Raspass is a business member and podcast host of Your Next Chapter, who supports business women craving more fulfillment in their life to confidently identify and turn their ideas and experience into unique, tangible, and impactful business models. She wraps her clients in strategic and emotional support to ensure sustainable growth through masterminds, retreats, and personal mentoring. Angela has been self-employed since 2003, having launched her own marketing consultancy at her dining room table with 2 small children underfoot. After a corporate career in market sponsorships and sales with News Limited ideas into action, expanded into a Sydney office with a team of full-time staff and clients in 3 states. In 2012, Angela decided to pivot into her own next chapter, moving from pure consulting to mentoring the rapidly growing audience of women-led solo and micro businesses. If you've been wanting to take the online HSP course, but it was out of your price range, hang tight until the end. I got some feedback, and so I have a special offer. I really want to make this accessible to as many people as possible. And now, on to the show. Hey, Angela, welcome.
Hello. Thank you for having me as a guest today.
I am so glad to have you here. Why don't you tell us where you're calling from?
I'm actually in Sydney, on the North Shore of Sydney, in a place called Bayview, which is, as the name suggests, if I look out my window right now, I can actually see the bay and some lovely boats bobbing around on a rather grey day, but it's a very peaceful place to be. I'm surrounded by trees and birds. This morning I was feeding the kookaburras and the cockatoos and the magpies, and it's a lovely place to be.
Oh my gosh, it sounds a little magical. Angela, can you tell us, well, first of all, do you identify as a highly sensitive person?
It's interesting. When I first heard that expression, I didn't, but then when I started to look at the way in which I respond to the world and show up in the world, I have to say, I think I am.
And is that recent that you looked it up, or have you known this for a while?
I think I've known, but I didn't have the label, so to speak. And I don't want to use the word label in a negative way. It's more of an identification, because if I look back on my life with kindsight, as I like to use that expression, I can see that I've always been a person that feels very deeply, and finds it almost in some ways difficult to let go of certain emotions because they seem to go down deeper layers in me than in my partner, for example. If I contrasted the two of us, I wouldn't say he's highly insensitive, but he just seems a little more resilient in terms of dealing with the emotions. And over the years, I've learned how to take better care of myself and to be able to not get stuck, to move through emotions more smoothly. But that certainly wasn't the case when I was younger. I mean, I was the proverbial, cry at the tissue ad, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's pretty common. Many of us who are highly sensitive have heard, you can't let things go. You take things too seriously. You need to lighten up. And it's like we feel things very deeply. And we're deep thinkers and we process deeply. So that's just not an innate trait for us to just naturally let things go. I think that we can learn to honor our feelings and, like you said, find ways to move through the emotions. But I think that's pretty common.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess I would also characterize myself as a very positive, optimistic person. I'm quite, my nickname when I was at school was Tigger, because I tend to bounce around a lot because I'm quite enthusiastic. But I think we are very good, and I'll use the term we in that inclusive way, at projecting in some ways the way that we think we should show up, but inside feeling very different. And it is that conflict between the two that I think can cause a lot of pain. It certainly did in my case.
Absolutely. Well, I think how we're wired authentically and the messages that we get growing up and then what we do with that as adults is how much integration is there between how we show up to the outside world and what's going on with us internally. And I think the bigger the discrepancy is, the more room there is to feel unhappy because we feel like if I showed up the way that I really am, people wouldn't like me.
And I think that piece there was the really important one from a highly sensitive person's perspective, being very sensitive to other people's opinions of us and feeling I identify as having been almost like a chameleon. Like, how do you want me to be so that you'll approve of me? And that can be really dangerous because you forget who you are.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think this kind of leads us right into the conversation that we're going to have today. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what brought you to the work that you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up in New Zealand and on a little farm in the suburbs south of Auckland. And it was a little bit of an idyllic childhood in the respect that, I was surrounded by pigs and cows and sheep and chickens and had lots of space to roam and be. And I was a lot younger than my siblings. They were a year apart, and then it was 7 years to me. So I spent a lot of time alone and had a very active imagination and used to get up to all sorts of things on the farm and in the garden, just, creating make-believe worlds, as I think is not uncommon with us. And all of that was really well. But when I got to high school, things started to change. I think it's safe to say that the high school environment is a bit of a zoo in lots of cases, a bit of a dog-eat-dog world in many cases. And I found it really, really difficult. I was quite academic, a bit nerdy, and got picked on mercilessly. I look back now and recognize the bullying that happened and what it did to me. It shut me down. It made me start to really question my value and my worth. And it was incredibly painful. And I think now, as we were talking before, with the identification now is knowing that I was highly sensitive, which is why it felt like I was walking around without skin. That's how it felt. I can now recognize that that's the reason why it was so difficult. Now, I'm sure there was lots of other teenagers going through similar stuff, but unlike today, we didn't talk about it as much. And I certainly didn't talk to my parents about how I was feeling. So I was a little bit left to sort of find my own way through. And the amount of self-doubt, and which actually really turned into self-loathing over the time, when you're in that sort of pain, if you can find a solution that will take away that pain, that feeling of not fitting in, of not measuring up, of just not being wired in the right way, then you're going to find that cure. And in my case, unfortunately, I turned to alcohol. Back where I grew up, there wasn't a lot for kids to do. In the weekends, we're a big rugby town, the game of rugby, and you used to move from suburb to suburb in the weekends. You'd get a great big hall, they'd put in a DJ, they'd open a bar, and all the young people would just go there. And that was it, and the weekends. And I, unfortunately, took to the beautiful at the stage effects of alcohol that numbed the pain, that numbed the insecurity, that numbed the concern about what you thought of me, all of that stuff. And so, unfortunately, over the years, that type of progressive illness, as I recognize it is now, takes its toll. And so when I eventually came to Australia and got married, had children, but I was still numbing the pain in the background quietly because I still didn't feel, even though I had all the external trappings of success, had a great job, etc., there was still that feeling inside of not measuring up, which I'm curious to see if that's a feeling that other people you've spoken to have had. Is there that feeling of not measuring up? Is that a highly sensitive experience?
Well, there's kind of a crossover. There's something called childhood emotional neglect. And if you're a highly sensitive person and you have a caregiver that's not highly sensitive, it's possible to experience childhood emotional neglect. And so that feeling of not good enoughness and a sense of comparing, chronic emptiness, depression. We also know with highly sensitive people that if they have caregivers that aren't attentive, they have difficult childhoods, there's a higher rate of anxiety and depression. You know, there is a connection, and whether it comes from an attuned caregiver or not. But I think that really what we're talking about is when we feel things deeply and we think about things deeply, if we have caregivers that aren't able to really embrace that in us and teach us how to manage, that's, I think, where that split happens. You know, if a child is told, like, why are you crying? Stop crying. You're so dramatic. Get over it. What we learn is how we show up in the world is not okay, and we learn to mask and cover it up. And so my guess is, this is anecdotal. I think that that's where oftentimes the addictions come in, because we're having this very big experience. We're being told not to, but we don't have the tools to do it differently. And so we kind of detach from our authentic self and have to figure out a way to get along in this world without having the tools. It's a long answer, but that's what I think.
That's okay. Mine was a long beginning, because if I think about, my parents, they're still alive. They're back in New Zealand, divorced and remarried. If I go back in time to their childhood, they had really, really rough childhoods, very physically tough, very emotionally tough. And we can only give from a place of wholeness ourselves. And my parents were great to the extent that they could be, but they certainly didn't understand the way that I was wired or really have the tools to deal with it. And I understand why. It was because of their own experiences. So there's nothing but compassion when I look back at my parents. But definitely that almost like division of self, when you keep getting the messages from the world around that you're a bit strange, that you're really not enough, that you don't fit, then yeah, that does cause immense pain. And as I said, in my case, the only way that I at that stage was capable of dealing with the pain was numbing it. And it's extremely common. And it's not just alcohol and drugs. It's also, shopping, eating, these days, internet addiction. There's so many things that take us away or put a buffer, a wall between what we're feeling that we don't want to feel and our ability to keep on going in the world.
Right. I want to go back to something with childhood emotional neglect. It's very possible to have very loving parents. Your parents were very well-intentioned, and it's just what didn't happen. And it doesn't have to mean that there was overt abuse or neglect, but it's not being able, if you're a highly sensitive person, a caregiver or a parent not being able to really honor what you were feeling and to help you work through it. So if you want to know a little bit more about childhood emotional neglect, I've done two-part episodes, and you can go back to episode, I think it's 20 and 26 if you're interested. But let's kind of move back to what we're talking about. So you started using alcohol, and it sounds like you were still able to function pretty well with the alcohol use, numbing the pain and the insecurity that was going on. Am I hearing you correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. And it was, and I think this happens with anyone that's listening that has an unhealthy relationship with alcohol. It doesn't start that way. It starts with joy and delight and fun and partying and being able to relax in social settings, and everything's good. But the trouble with it is that if you use any sort of substance or situation to numb the bad feelings, you don't get to choose which feelings it numbs. It also numbs the good. And so over time, it brings life into gray shades, into shades of gray, because the way, well, in my case, unfortunately, it did go to the stage where I identify as being an alcoholic, though I'm a sober alcoholic and have been for almost 13 years. But it got to a point where I could not take alcohol because I couldn't imagine life without it. And when I chose that at a stage where I wanted to stop, I found that I couldn't. And I was physically, but also I'm very much emotionally dependent on it, because the fear that would come up of moving through life without it was terrifying. But I did keep it for a very long time at that level where, I was defined as, if you want to go to the dictionary definition, a highly functioning alcoholic. So meaning that I handled everything, but it was the quiet behind the scenes, hidden drinking that kept my fear under control. But I was 37 when it got to the stage where, even though, again, as I was saying, on the outside I could cope, on the inside it was doing an absolute hatchet job, because the self-loathing that comes up when you, well, in my experience, when you are addicted to a substance that you realize is not good for you, and that it's a depressant, so it does move you towards that real negativity. And so the thing that used to provide you with the healing and the numbness, in a good way, is now turned on you. It's turned on you and it's taking away rather than giving. And I had young children and it was time to change. But it's very hard to ask for the help that you need when there's a lot of shame attached to something like that.
Sure. And I think too that we have this idea that we should be able to control it. We should be able to stop, and that sense of self-demoralization because we can't, it gets to a point where we can't control it and we keep doing this behavior that we know doesn't work and we're not able to control it and stop. I think that just compounds that feeling of feeling really ineffective about who we are and then having shame on top of it. And usually we're using substances because there's already shame about who we are. So
exactly. It's the cycle. It's the cycle of addiction. You use something to make you feel better and it makes you feel bad for using it. And because you're feeling terrible, then what's the only thing you can do? You use it again and you just get stuck in that horrible cycle, and it becomes Groundhog Day, not in a good way. And that sense of isolation, you can't talk about this stuff. I have a great big girl crush on Brene Brown, and I love her first book that I read. I thought it was just me, but it isn't. It was like really opening my eyes to how I was feeling. And she described shame as something, if you keep it in the closet, in the dark, then it festers and it grows. It feeds on secrecy. It absolutely feeds on it, and that's its fuel to grow bigger and bigger. And that's exactly what was going on, because I couldn't talk about it, because you imagine as a sensitive person, it was that feeling of shame was compounded because you feel everything so much more strongly. And so I think it actually anchors you into potential addictions much more deeply if you do have this tendency towards high sensitivity. But she also says that if you take it out of the cupboard into the light, if you're courageous and vulnerable enough to do that, that's when it will die. It cannot live under the spotlight of openness and vulnerability. And that was definitely my experience when I'd tried everything. Like I'd gone to health farms and I'd sworn off this and that, and I'd stop drinking that, just drink that, different times of the day. Like you try everything to try and trick the addiction into receding. And when I realized it wasn't going to work, eventually I had to surrender. The biggest step is surrendering, recognizing that you don't have the answer. And as they say in the recovery circles, it's when you stop living in the problem and you start living in the solution, then the problem goes away. And that was my experience when I joined the recovery movement, as I said, almost 13 years ago, and realized that I wasn't a bad person who had to become good. I was a sick person who had to become well. And that's in those circles where we talked about our experience, strength and hope, what it was like, what happened, what it's like now. That's where I found other kindred spirits, and I was literally loved back to life. You tell your stories that you wouldn't want to really share in the mainstream world, and no one fell off their chair. They would just nod and go, yeah, I feel that way too. And that's, Patricia, when I recognized that, and again, my own interpretation here, that almost every person who were in the recovery rooms was highly sensitive. They felt things. They just felt the world. They felt the judgment. They felt the fear so intensely that they had to numb in some way. That's my description. But we certainly all identified as very sensitive people. And that expression I gave you earlier about feeling as though I was walking around the world without my skin on, that comes from the recovery movement, because that's how we describe ourselves. That's what I heard in the rooms. And I identified immediately with feeling that way.
I'm just absorbing everything that you're saying. Yeah, I agree. And I think there's so much power in naming what's going on. And when we share about it, it does break the shame, because as soon as we talk about, what I talk about is our gremlins or whatever we think we wouldn't want someone to know about us, that allowing people to see our vulnerability, if it's a safe person in a safe situation, our humanity, our messiness, that's really where growth and connection starts. And so much of our training is about don't allow people to see that. I've also wondered what the correlation is between people that are in 12-step programs and sensitivity. I don't know it. I can only guess, but I've really wondered about that, because I ended up using food at a very early age. And I also suspect that people that are highly sensitive, if you tend to use substances to numb your feelings, my guess is that also means that when things are going really well and we get overstimulated, if we don't have tools to know how to kind of regulate our nervous system, my guess is that we're probably likely to shop or spend or have sex or get on our phones or, whatever the thing is that we use to kind of help to manage our emotions.
Absolutely. I think there is no doubt a very distinct correlation between the two. If you imagine, I guess one of my experiences was we would feel, and I'll say we, again, with the positive inclusiveness, we can feel down very easily and quite dramatically because of that sensitivity, but we can equally feel incredibly high. So you can go both ways, ecstatic and like demoralized, and then delighted and sad, and like this really up and down. And I think one of the things that has happened over time, and I mean this in a good way, is they've evened out more because I now do have tools to recognize the reasons behind the emotions, because emotions are always created by thinking. And if you can get a handle on your thoughts and recognize what was the trigger that made you think a certain thing, which therefore makes you feel a certain way, then you can reassure yourself and you can allow yourself to move through and not get stuck. That's probably the number one. I've got lots and lots of them, but one of the number one tools that I use these days is just self-realization and recognition. Wow, you're feeling really, really down at the moment. Like your emotions are really flat. And you're feeling like, this is in my business, for example, which is going really well, but I'm feeling really bad. Why is that? And to just have some self-inquiry, work backwards, see and recognize and know your own triggers. One of mine in particular is comparison, which is very dangerous for me. And when you recognize it, you can apply the balm of self-compassion, recognize where it comes from. That's why you're feeling that way. Well, that's okay. That's understandable. You've been here before. You're feeling fear, or you're feeling comparison, or you're feeling envy, or you're feeling whatever it is. And you're human. Feeling that's fine. Let's just allow it to move. And I get through emotions far quicker these days. Whereas something that used to take me down on take me out at the knees and keep me down for 2, 3, 4 days will usually pass now in just 2 or 3 hours, because I honor the emotion and allow it to be identified and for it to pass through.
Right. I find that where I get stuck sometimes is I get mad that I'm having the feeling, and then I get mad that I'm mad. And then I feel inadequate, or imposter syndrome will come up because, I'm supposed to know this stuff. And I find that I have mastery in certain areas, and then something new will come up and it happens again. I'm like, oh, I'm in that uncomfortable, yucky cycle again. Isn't this interesting?
Yeah, here it is again. And that concept of the second arrow, I can't remember. Tara Brach actually is who I heard it through, I think. It's a great spiritual leader. And she talked about the second arrow. So the first arrow is the pain. And then the second arrow is the hard time that we give ourselves over feeling the pain. So that was what you were just describing. And so I constantly remind myself to beware of the second arrow. Don't beat yourself up for feeling like that. Don't make yourself wrong. But that's a practice. I mean, all these things we have to deal with and work through. There is no like, there you go, done with that. Okay, now I'm serene. That just isn't the case at all. We have to, I believe, to keep ourselves in fit spiritual state, we need a daily practice that helps us. So I refer to this as the bookends of my day and the park bench of my day. May I explain those?
Please, I'd love to hear.
So this is the concept of how you start your day, how you end your day, and how you take moments within your day. Typical morning for me this morning, the alarm goes off around 6:15, and I use the Daily Calm app to do a short meditation. So it's about 10 minutes. For someone like me who suffers from what I call popcorn brain, as in it's hard to control my thoughts, they're always bouncing all over the place, having a guided meditation really helps. So instead of just leaping out of bed and attacking the day, I take those 10 to 15 minutes of just quiet contemplation, listening to the meditation app, imagining how my day is going to go, and then I start my day. So that's the first bookend. The end of the day is when I use gratitude and reflection. So I've kept a gratitude journal since the very first day of sobriety. It was explained to me that my brain needed some retraining, that it was looking at the negative far too easily because of the past experiences, and that a gratitude list would help retrain my brain to filter for the good. And so probably 90% of the time, because we're not talking perfect here, I will reflect on the day and I will write down 4 or 5 things that I'm grateful for and a couple of things that I did well that day. So positive self-regard is really important. So those 2 bookends of the day, how I start and how I end. Then in the middle of the day or throughout the day, I use what I call the park benches. Now, a park bench is just when you pause, sit down, breathe, and appreciate, just to try and keep yourself in, again, that fit spiritual state. It might be that you're connecting with a higher power. It's totally up to you. But it's just remembering in those little pockets of time during what can be a very busy day to pause, breathe, and appreciate. So it's the bookends and the park benches, and they help. I constantly do that. If I sleep well, if I eat well, then I'm in much better condition than if I'm racing around like a maniac and just allowing the day to dictate to me without me putting those parameters in it to keep me in a good state.
Right. And we've talked about what I call the proper care and feeding of the highly sensitive person, which is these things that you're talking about, making sure that we get enough rest and that we eat foods that work for us. And if we need to lovingly move our body, and then just what you're talking about is taking time for quiet reflection. Dr. Elaine Aarons suggests 2 hours a day. That's not always possible. I love when I go to bed at night, when I remember, I kind of like to run through the day in my mind and I count on my fingers like all the things that I felt good about or that I felt grateful for. So it's a different form of doing gratitude, but it's still acknowledging the things that happen during the day that, I'm feeling grateful for. So I really like that.
Yeah, it's certainly kept me in good stead over the years. And once I understood the true nature of who I am and why, in my case, why did I turn to or fall into the clutches of addiction, so to speak, and went through the forgiveness and understood that doesn't have to happen again if I do take good care of myself mentally, emotionally, spiritually, physically, all elements. Then the world started to open up again because I was always aware that there was great potential in life. There were so many things that I could do, but I seemed to constantly be hamstrung. I did really well. Don't get me wrong. I was a high achiever in terms of the work that I was doing and then starting a business and that, but everything was slightly blunted because I hadn't really attached to and really understood what was important for the way that I show up in the world. Wasn't really doing the work I'm supposed to be doing. Or the expression that I use is that I was heading in a direction, then alcohol in my case took me on a big detour. But now I'm coming back onto the path of becoming the person I've always been meant to be. And that feels great, knowing that, I just turned 50 and it feels like life is just beginning. It really does. Like turning this, I call it your next chapter and moving into the next stage. And it feels really exciting and it feels so full of possibility and potential because I'm no longer working on autopilot. Now I've got my full faculties, so to speak, and have been, we're on this growth trajectory for all of our lives. And things just started getting better and better since I stepped into recovery, as I said, almost 13 years ago. But the best is yet to come. Can't wait to see what's around the corner.
Yep. There's something too that happens, a sense of, I think, self-esteem and self-efficacy when we take the difficult steps to care for ourselves on a daily basis. If we're not using blame and judgment if we don't, but there's something about just taking those steps on a daily basis, it really builds a sense of self-esteem. And it can even be something simple like making your bed, brushing your teeth, basic pieces of self-care that really build us up and help us know that we can count on ourselves. And oftentimes we don't know that. And so when we don't do those things, it creates lethargy or anxiety or depression because we're overwhelmed or we feel like we're not taking care of the things that we need to do. And so there's a real fine line of not using this as information to beat yourself up with and having an incredible amount of self-compassion. And the gift of self-care is it really brings a sense of competency.
Absolutely. I think the point that you're making there, I'd like to extend slightly, is something. There's a fellow called Russ Harris who's here in Australia, and he's like the Australian father of ACT, acceptance commitment therapy, which is something that I came across a few years ago and trained in and loved it. The concepts, which if I break it right down, it's about taking action aligned with your values. And it's about understanding that the actions of confidence come first and the feelings of confidence come later. And I think that can be applied to any of the things that